So I got the camera pointed the right way, but it zoomed in on my crotch, so I can't share that with decent human beings. So apparently I can zoom out. I don't know what you're doing. Get out of here. Recording and stream. Okay, there it is. Nice. Wunderbar. And then a little bit this way.
Is that the person, friend maybe see if someone financially back. Yeah,
very nice.
My uncle, we were talking on the phone about it. Like that, yeah, that's awesome. That's so nice.
Welcome. Hello. Welcome, welcome. Yes. Where's the damn thing? Oh, here it is. Need the space. Okay, my friends. So last time we threw a wrench into the categorical imperative to see how it would respond. And the response we got was, okay, we can add an exception clause to the maxim to say, don't lie unless axe murderer orphan thing, right? But we realized soon after that there's probably more than just that reason to, justify the occasional fib, right? If the stakes are low and you can just make somebody feel better, sure, bend the truth a little bit. But the instances in which that seems to be acceptable, if it were to become something close to a complete list, would become what we call a 9,000-page maxim. And that means that the theory becomes unwieldy. We can't use it on the fly. It's no longer pocket-sized. We then realized that coming to that conclusion contains an assumption that human cognition is like artificial electronic cognition, right? That it has to be very detailed, very anal, very specific, very clear. But human cognition also operates by what are called rules of thumb. And as such, we can simply say, right, rules of thumb are just very broad and kind of arm wavy, right? They're like this, you do, yeah, it's about like that, right? Maybe that's the etymology of it. Who knows? It was fun to do though, try it. And so what that means is we can have a pocket-sized 4-word maxim, don't lie unless harm. Oh, good, okay. So maybe the harm light goes off, or this smells a little bit like there might be harm in the area. And so we zoom in and get facts of the case and apply what's called stricter scrutiny to see the nature of the harm and whether or not the harm is grave enough to warrant suspending our commitment not to lie because of the general implications thereof, that it contradicts itself when universalized as a maxim. So we can say, some people say that the use of certain words, saying certain words to people causes harm. And that's controversial. But I think probably 30 slaughtered infants, that's definitely going to check the harm box without any controversy at all, right? And so in thinking of it that way, in getting human cognition's description right, we've successfully patched deontology. Or not. That's up to you in the next essay. By the way, I reckon I'll assign the next essay 2 weeks from probably today, and it'll be due 2 weeks hence. Okay, which does, get us kind of close to the end of the semester. But also during that 2 weeks, while you're writing the paper, I'm going to be talking about new stuff. So we'll get there. It's going to fit. So alternately, having looked at these theories and how, deontologists and utilitarians sit around just throwing counterexamples at each other, trying to throw a wrench into each other's systems, maybe you come to an insight that the problem is systems itself. that maybe these machine-like proceduralist systems are insufficient to the task of capturing the incredible variety, imagination, and wildness of human experience and behavior. And so, if it's systems that you think are the problem, then you can go anti-systematist. And that means Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche didn't get to being an anti-systematist by the same path of reasoning that we have, right? He gets there via a pretty wild path that I'm going to try to convey to you today. He read at Lutheran seminary, he read the work of Arthur Schopenhauer and was, if you will, philosophically radicalized by it, right? So I'm going to try to convey for you how Schopenhauer works and how Nietzsche, how it influences Nietzsche's metaphysics. We have to go back to metaphysics to understand why Nietzsche reasons the way he does about ethics, okay? And so, as I said earlier, or last time, unlike Kant, Mill, Plato, and Aristotle, for those guys, I just went down step by step and said, all right, cave, here's the message inside, that's coded into the cave, the ontological hierarchy. No. And then for Aristotle, and then, right, for Mill, it's maximal utility. For Kant, it's universalize the maxim without contradiction. And I can just go step by step and show you those things. Nietzsche is, as an anti-systematist, deliberately non-linear. He's non-linear in his thinking. When we read his stuff, it's only going to be 2 paragraphs that we read. But if you crack open a book of Nietzsche's work, right, Beyond Good and Evil, for example, is one of them. It's just a bunch of paragraphs, separate paragraphs called aphorisms. And he's like, here's this thought, here's this thought, here's this thought, here's this thought. And it's a bit maddening, and it actually infuriated me as a 19-year-old scholar of Nietzsche when somebody told me, you really can't understand any of Nietzsche without having read all of Nietzsche. I'm like, damn, I want to know if the juice is worth the squeeze. And I don't want to have squeeze and no juice, right? But I kept squeezing and there's juice. So what we're going to do is, instead of linearity, right, you guys have seen spider diagrams before. You've got the central node, the main point, and then you've got ancillary. Ancillary means supporting. Means subordinate to, but supporting the main point, okay? So all the ideas are going to be so what we're going to do is kind of take various passes over this territory and see how it's shaped together without getting too much into the weeds on the concepts. For example, when I explain Arthur Schopenhauer, and before him, Immanuel Kant's metaphysics, and before him, David Hume's metaphysics, and before him, Locke's metaphysics. We're going to do all that today. Right? All of those things are organized around a single node for Nietzsche that we're going to call will to power, that he calls will to power. But both will and power are going to be used in a very different sense. Okay? For Nietzsche, this is crucial. Will, the concept of will, right? Double quotes is the word, single quotes is the concept. Will is, for Nietzsche, non-teleological. And he gets that from Schopenhauer. So we're used to saying, right, I have the idea that I want to pick up the pen. My will turns the idea into the action, right? That's teleological. Remember telos from Aristotle? A telos is an aim. So teleological means that we're looking at things, purpose, right? The purpose, the aim, the goal of a thing. And the teleological fallacy is when we look at the universe and say, well, look, this thing functions in a particular way, therefore that's the purpose God gave it. No, you can't conflate. Conflation is confusing two things as one. Just because a thing functions a certain way doesn't mean that that's a purpose, right? So you haven't unearthed the wonderful plan behind everything. That's why they call it faith. Stop trying to prove God through science. You're always going to lose. Right? This is kind of gross, but and I don't eat seafood like this, but you know when you eat a lobster, my mom did this to me once. She's like, we had lobster, and look, I have the claw. And she still did the thing, and I was just like, oh, fuck you. At age 5, right? Yeah, you can still make it function, and it's got that function. But there's not purpose. There's no purpose to it. That died with the lobster, right? Lobsters are teleological. Their various body parts are just function, okay? So the weirdest thing about will, as we're going to talk about it today, is just force. It's not towards anything. Okay, and there's a reason for that, and it's because we have to talk a certain way, or rather not talk a certain way, about causality. So with all that kind of suspended in mind at the moment, let's go through and try to be as linear as possible, getting to Nietzsche's metaphysical jumping off point, which he gets from Schopenhauer. Okay? So remember, Nietzsche says that philosophy has been a 2,500-year mistake. That when the pre-Socratics, who were the bravest people, right, the bravest, most adventurous thinkers of all time, they were standing on no shoulders of any giants. They were just looking at things and going, okay, let's talk about how this thing was alive yesterday and today it's dead. What the hell happened? How does change happen? What is this source of change? How does that happen? So, and then, while the pre-Socratics were busy doing that, Socrates and Plato broke in on the scene and said, all right, you freaks, quit all of your crazy quibbling. From now on, we're going to clear the ranks. Philosophy is about the search for truth. That's the mistake, Nietzsche said, that we made. That in fact, philosophy is not about the search for truth, but something deeper. Philosophy is about finding what improves life. Okay? And we talked about, you know, maybe somebody, if we psychologize him, and we said that Nietzsche is fair game for psychologizing because he does it to other philosophers, maybe you end up being the guy who says God is dead when at 4 years old you go through the months-long trauma of hearing your father, the god of the family, howling in agony from a brain ailment until he just croaked. That's horrible, right? Surrounded by death. Then his younger brother 6 months later. So Nietzsche, from a very young age, was at the precipice of something horrifying and deep, okay? Right in time for Halloween, too. How considerate. So, to explain how we get to Schopenhauerian will, right, Schopenhauerian metaphysics, we start with the English philosopher John Locke, who gave us, if not the first, then the most robust, I just want to say robust, conception of a philosophical position known as empiricism. So we've been talking about the empiricals. They have nothing to do with empires, but rather data. In specific, the data that we garner via our 5 senses. Okay? And so what Locke said is, because of our wonderful human imagination, because of that powerful imagination that we have, it is quite possible for us to get things wrong. For example, if I say there's a blue sphere suspended here, there are all kinds of ways that you can remember that the wrong way. You can get it wrong. It's orange, it's blue, it's red, right? It's not a sphere, it's a cube or a pyramid. It's on the ground, not suspended, right? And if you see how I listed those things, the ways to get it wrong vastly outnumber getting it right because of the ways that we can manipulate ideas. And so, given that we want to separate the wheat from the chaff and be able to rely upon legitimate ideas rather than just goofy stuff we cook up in our heads, right? Like Pegasus. Oh, what if it had wings, right? Oh, what if there was a horse instead of a, yeah. Right? That we need to do the following. If we're going to call an idea legitimate, that idea has to be traced back to a sensory experience. Hence empiricism. All legitimate ideas come from the empirical realm, And all ideas are either simple ideas or complex ideas, and complex ideas are made of one thing and one thing only, and that's simple ideas. So a simple idea, for example, would be the blackness or the whiteness of this marker. Kind of like Platonic forms, right? This partakes in the form of whiteness, but it doesn't have to. Locke doesn't appeal to anything extraterrestrial. He's just talking about when you looked at it, you saw black and you saw white. Each of those, the whiteness and the blackness, is a simple idea. And then we can form things like religions, monetary systems, and governments, those complex ideas, but they're all made up from only one thing, and that's different organizations of simple ideas. Are you with me so far? Good. So if you can't point to it in experience, you can't really talk about it legitimately, okay, as a legitimate idea. Let's refresh ourselves. Yeah, sure. So Locke came up with empiricism. Then a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, was also an empiricist. And Hume, took Locke's empiricism to its logical extremes and came up with what's called the problem of induction. Now, you can probably tell this already, but let me just say, in case it's not clear to you, this is a total drive-by of like 300 years of metaphysical philosophy writing, right? And so I'm not going to do everybody in the story justice. I just want to get us to the vestibule of Nietzsche's work, okay? The vestibule is the entranceway. And so I'm taking the kind of cleanest path there without getting into the weeds. If at any point during this you notice a place where you're like, hey, I'd like to get into the weeds on that, I'm your boy, okay? I can point you there, I can discuss it with you. But the problem of induction, right, basically says, you know, something like, assuming that because the sun came up today, that the sun will rise tomorrow, we're not entitled to that induction, right? But we make it just to keep ourselves sane, right? It's a habit of mind. But there is no argument, Hume says, in order to say, because the sun rose today, it will rise tomorrow, even if there's clouds, you can't see it, but it's still rising. It's actually not rising, the earth is turning, you know. But keep it simple. There is no argument for the claim that the future will resemble the past. We just take that as granted, right? Another way of saying that is, we can't talk about causality. So let's look at billiard balls. Nice simple illustration. And here's billiard ball A and billiard ball B. Very special names I picked up in particular for these ones. And suppose we play the game and we use the shaft to strike ball A such that it comes into contact with ball B, and then somebody tell me, what happens then? Oh, magic.
It goes straight.
Yeah. And we say that ball A caused ball B to move. Well, Hume says, look, here's what we actually see. We see one event, A striking B, followed by another event, ball B moving. Two things. There's no third thing in the middle called a cause. We can't point to a cause. The most we can say is that when we see one, it is followed by two. And when we see two, it's been preceded by one. So Hume calls that constant conjunction. Conjunction is the two things are conjoined. They're together. They occur right next to each other in space-time, right? And it's constant if we do it 20 times or 2,000 times. Right? We can be here all night and see the same thing happening, and all we're seeing is two things, two occurrences. There's no third thing in there called a cause. Well, if we can't talk about cause, we basically can't talk about science or do any kind of explaining of phenomena. Right? Now, obviously, even Hume himself said, okay, I get it. While we sit beside the fire with our glasses of bourbon and talk smack about philosophy, of course, we can then go back into the other room and play pool and walk out and see the sun rose today, right? But there's no philosophical account for it, even though we depend upon it, but we depend upon what he just calls a habit of mind. Okay? So, having read Hume, another German we've been familiar with, Immanuel Kant. We've only talked about his ethics, not his metaphysics. Kant went through a multi-year depression and destitution, having read Hume, thinking that, oh my God, my life's work has been for naught. I've been dedicating all the days of my life to an utter fool's errand. And so, as Kant puts it in his own writing, he was awoken by Hume from his dogmatic slumber. The slumber being that he can just say, yeah, you know, cause. Kind of like Frege in the number one, right? You know, one. If you don't know one, you're less than dumb, right? But no, Frege says, no, if you're going to use a term, define it. It doesn't matter how much we're in the habit of just using it without, right? And so what Kant did was he set out to offer a philosophical account of causality. Okay? We're about halfway there. We're about halfway to Nietzsche. That's ahead, my version. And what's uncontroversial is that within us, we've been having what we talk about this whole semester long, this five-sensory movie, right? Kant calls that well, they all call it that, the phenomenal realm. Within us is this five-sensory movie we're experiencing right now. It has been all day since we woke up. Before that, it was just experiencing our dreams. God help us. And all of that is phenomena, right? The appearance of things that we have in our heads. And of course, the simplest version of this is that things are just exactly as they are, right? What you see is what you get, and the phenomena and whatever else is out here, let's call this the mind-independent realm. The mind-independent realm, right? The simplest version is called direct object realism. That what you see is what you get. I'm perceiving this eraser as I am, and there's nothing to it but what I see, and I'm getting all of it there. But you know, on the molecular level, this thing is mostly space, not matter, right? So what is it really, right? It's more of an energy field produced by molecules being close together and as close together as my molecules that compose the hand that's holding it, right? So we can't stick with direct object realism because that gets problematic really quickly. So again, nobody disputes that there is a phenomenal realm. The entire game is how it gets there. What's going on? What's bringing this to us? How does that happen, right? And so whatever it is that's in the mind-independent world, the mind-independent realm, right? You can use either one. We can't, as it were, circumvent our senses so that I can get around my five senses to experiencing something direct. What would that even look like? I pluck out my eye and go like this at it? No, that's silly, right? The only way we can experience reality is through this kind of screen. It's like the screen on those, but it's organic rather than electronic and mechanical, right? We only experience things via our five senses and not in any other way. And even if you add a sixth sense, all right, fine, but that's the, you know, it's only via this indirect way, okay? And so Kant said, when we talk about the mind-independent world, we're referring to not things that as we experience them, that's the phenomena, but things in themselves. And we can only describe our experience, right? Because that's what we're drawing from, to make our descriptions. And so we can't give things in themselves, which Kant calls, let's give it a vague kind of shape, calls them noumena. Noumena. So we have the noumenal realm and the phenomenological realm, and the phenomenal realm, right? Either word's grammatical, okay? And because we can't access them except via our five senses, things in themselves are ones we can't describe in terms of height or weight or shape or color. Kant admits all of that. But what he does say about the noumena, about things in themselves, hey, I don't know what else I can tell you about noumena, but I tell you one thing. Ta-da! They're causal. And so that's how the movie gets there. Things in themselves, even though we can't say anything else about them, we can say they're causal. I have defeated Hume, hands dusted, Kant for the win. Oops. How did he blow that one? What fallacy is that? We looked at that fallacy at the beginning of the semester.
It's like
I don't think so. I'm glad you tried. What did Kant set out to do? Right? So Kant was sitting there playing with cause his whole life, just going, hey, isn't it great that we can talk about things like this? And Hume, the big bully, came up and said, nope, took his ball away. And so Kant was like, okay, I'm going to try this again. I'm going to try to come up with a philosophical account so that we can actually reasonably and sensibly talk about cause. That's the conclusion he's going for.
Is he begging the question?
Hillary for the win. Yes. When you smuggle in your intended conclusion as a premise, I don't know what else to tell you about noumena, but hey, isn't this cool? It's causal. Total question begging. Hillary, you get all the points today. There are no points, but you get them all. Okay, great. Thank you for that. And that, now Kant, let's just make sure nobody goes away feeling bad. Kant, I'm pretty sure, died happy, thinking he had, right, saved the world for science. But it was Schopenhauer who went on the record saying, this is question begging. Okay? So, this whole, right, all this stuff that Kant gave us, right, Schopenhauer snatched the ball out of his hand again, post-mortem, if you will. So Schopenhauer now says, well, okay, I'm going to tell you what we're left with, right? The position he's in is saying you can't extend the causal relationships that we have among our phenomena to the mind-independent world. So what Schopenhauer sets before himself as a task is, how am I going to give an account of how the phenomena get there? Because the phenomena get there. We're all good on that one. But I've got to come up with a way of explaining change in phenomena without reference to causality. And what he posits is will. So we're getting close to will to power, which is Nietzsche's main thing. Okay? Only will, remember, is non-teleological. Okay? Schopenhauerian will, we're going to call it Schopenhauerian will, as opposed to Aristotelian will, which is teleological, right? Schopenhauerian will is nothing but a blind urge towards survival, towards reproduction. It's blind. And it's destined to collide with itself and not be coordinated. It is this uncaring, unintelligent, unconcerned about humans, certainly, force. right? I think of it as this advancing black cloud, but even that gives it too much personality, right? And that's reality, folks, according to Schopenhauer. And so if we're chained via our five senses to this uncaring, right, unconcerned, blind, surging force, we got our fifis, right? We care about not suffering, right? People still say fifis? Feelings? No? Okay, anyway. I'm always getting antiquated. I can't keep up, and it's fun not to keep up. You get some funny combinations. Like if I said kicking the knowledge in here, that's something we used to say back in the early 90s. Or dropping science. I haven't said those words since before I even became a grad student, and now I do it for dollars. I shake it up here for dollar bills and make it rain. Okay, let's go back to this, right? Schopenhauer says, ethically, because we are governed by basically the opposite of God, right? Just this monster. It's not even a monster. Calling it a monster gives it too much personality, right? And we're chained to that. The best way to live life is a negation of feeling and emotion, the way the Buddhists recommend. You may be familiar with Buddhism, but basically the goal in Buddhism is extinguishment. Nirvana means extinguishment. That the reason we suffer, life is dukkha, and the word dukkha roughly translated is suffering, but just means that we're kind of being pulled down in this way. And the cause, second noble truth of the Buddha, is the cause of dukkha is tanha, T-A-N-H-A. Tanha is connection, right? And it's not just, what's my favorite flavor of ice cream? That's a connection. Or which parent do I prefer to visit? That's a connection. But even that the face you see in the mirror is actually you. That's just a connection, right? And that you have a mind is a connection. And believing you exist is the final connection to just let go of. And that's extinguishment, right? And it sounds really fun, right? That sounds depressing as hell. But that's what Buddhists and Arthur Schopenhauer say we should live our lives like, because will is just not helping us. Will's not on our side, okay? Nietzsche totally agrees with that, but says actually Arthur Schopenhauer, Arthur was his first name. Actually, Arthur, you still got too much in the picture. There are no two realms. There is only one realm, and it is all will. And what we call will universally is the same thing as our phenomena. It's the same exact thing, will and phenomena, seen from two different perspectives. Will is the same phenomena seen externally, and phenomena is will seen internally. Okay? And the relationship between them is like, I don't know if this happens to you guys, but if you close your eyes and you squish your eyelids, that like makes colors and stuff, kind of like that. But for Nietzsche, the world is just will through and through, without two different realms. So that's the metaphysical picture I have to get through in order to get to why, for Nietzsche, the root of everything is will to power. Okay, so that's one sort of swoop over the landscape of Nietzsche, okay? So what we know most intimately as our will is that universal will, but seen from inside of us. And so this is now Nietzsche going forward, okay? Once we get up to Schopenhauer, we can explain Nietzsche agrees with Schopenhauer about his metaphysical picture. Where he differs with Schopenhauer is the response to it. Schopenhauer says, looking at this picture, we must be like the Buddhists and withdraw and negate and reject. Nietzsche says, your description is exactly the same, but the response is, I'm not going to say no. I'm going to say yes to it. And that being like, you know what, screw you, I'm not going to let it get me down. I'm going to respond to all of this with a thoroughly human, resounding yes in reply that makes Nietzsche so weird and unique. Okay. So again, going forward, we're talking about Nietzsche's ideas. We're done with the other contributors to his ideas. So going forward with Nietzsche, if will is indeed the single force behind all phenomena, then the cosmos is not at all at heart rational, but irrational. And we, as creatures, as children of this irrational cosmos, must also be irrational within us. But we put on a rational surface so that we can go along to get along, right? And have a life, right? And so we have this irrational core that we kind of coat with a rational surface, okay? And now we're going to get to another part of Nietzsche where he says that good and evil is the wrong way, right? This is where we get to his ethics. The talk about good and evil misses human beings in their true nature. And that if we're going to account for this dialectic, a dialectic is a conversation of two opposing forces, okay? And it's not necessarily opposing. It's opposing in the way that two dancers dance the same dance, but they have different parts in it, okay? And the irrational core of ourselves, he names after a Greek god, Dionysus. He calls that the Dionysian impulse. Instead of good and evil, we should talk about the Dionysian impulse and its dialectic with the other part of us, the rational surface, the Apollonian, named after the god Apollo. So we have within us, right, deeper than the very superficial good and evil, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do, naughty boy, right? The way to get more deeply at the reality of human beings in this kind of metaphysic is to talk about the dance, the dialectic between the Dionysian and the Apollonian within us. I'll be more descriptive about this later, but in brief, the Dionysian is the party part of us, right? The party soul, right? The dancing, the fun, the celebrating. The Greeks used to have Dionysian festivals. And in these festivals, they would engage in animal sacrifice and feasting, followed by massive consumption of psychedelic mushrooms and a gigantic citywide orgy. I didn't tell them to do it. I'm just telling you what they did. Don't blame me. But so that's the Dionysian impulse to kind of, you know, tear it up a little bit. And the Apollonian impulse is the rule-making, rule-obeying, system-making part of our psyche, okay? Freud actually called Nietzsche the first psychologist because of his trying to get at the inner world of human beings and the dramas therein, right? So it's a step up from Plato's tripartite soul, right? And so the way to understand humans best in their full capacity is in this interplay between our irrational and rational parts. And what it's going to turn out he's going to say that we need to do, he says he heralds the oncoming age of the Übermensch. Uber, right? U-B-E-R, Ubermensch first was translated into English as Superman, and it's the actual source of the superhero, who before World War II was kind of a dick, right? He's like, look at me, he had the cape and everything, right? But he's like, look at me, I'm big, I'm gonna throw your car, ha, right? But only after World War II did Superman start fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, okay? But Uber is not actually translated as super. It means over, as in overcoming ourselves, as in overcoming our over-reliance upon the Apollonian and reconnecting with our Dionysian. That we overcome our tendency to become slaves to systems like Mill and Kant or provide us, right? And so his idea is entirely restorative, not replace. He's not saying we should get rid of the Apollonian and replace it with the Dionysian. That would last about a day, and it'd be really fun, but then we'd all be dead, right? But that in order to create, and this is what we've done, and this is not only what philosophy has done, but Christianity also. Christianity comes in for a major hammering under Nietzsche, even though guess who he thinks is the greatest Ubermensch of all time? Christ, because if you want to say overcoming, talk about the meek will inherit the earth. That's not been the way the world has worked since before humans, right? It was all might is right, might makes right. But to tip that on its head and say the meek shall inherit the earth, that's pretty uber, right? What he hates is the church, right? Nietzsche says Jesus was real, but we've been getting his message wrong, and we get it more wrong all the time. But so in order, and Christianity and philosophy have both done this, is they've allowed us to make this Faustian bargain. What's a Faustian bargain? Faust gained, he made a deal with the devil. That's who you make a deal with, right? Robert Johnson down at the crossroads. To have dominion over the earth, but it cost him his soul. Yeah. He gained everything, but he lost his soul. That's kind of what Nietzsche is saying we've done here. His main project is the restoration of the Dionysian impulse in humans. Okay? Which actually looks like, doesn't have to have orgies and mushrooms, right? But we have to be a little less reliant. We have to be a little less slave-like in our ethical thinking. That's why that's why good and evil aren't going to do it anymore. That's why the book is called Beyond Good and Evil. Okay, one of them. But the passage we're going to read, and it's there now. Please do at your earliest convenience read that. But it's from the book called Beyond Good and Evil. But in order to create a more predictable, a more safe world, we have given ourselves almost entirely over to the Apollonian. To the point where we're going to become so dependent upon systems that we turn into robots. Does anybody know the etymology, the history of the word robot? It's a Czech word, as in Czechoslovakia, that means slave. And so in the reading, it's only 2 paragraphs, but they're long, he distinguishes slave morality, which is obedience in Apollonian, to master morality, which is knowing when to stick to the rules and when to kind of, do your own thing. Okay? So one of the things that Nietzsche criticizes this Apollonian, this overblown Apollonian humanity that he sees in front of him, and he even, while he's talking about the Apollonian and trying to explain what he means, he even contrasts Northern Europe with Southern Europe. You know, if you've ever spent any time with Danes, they're just like, they're made out of freaking hardwood. They're like, super anal. Whereas you get down to Spain and Italy and things are a little more loose, right? Passionate, right? But there's more, right? But wait, there's more. As we have become more Apollonian, we have, in our Christianity, right, I may have alluded to this earlier when we were talking about Plato, the realm of the forms and the idea that reality is in this other place is something that the Christians took with and ran with, right? Do not put all your eggs in this basket. You should spend this life anticipating the afterlife. Right? Did I tell you why the Christians do that and not the Jews or the Muslims? Okay, so early in Christianity, there was a split in the Christian faith between Jacob, or James, on one hand, the Apostle James, and Paul. And James, you'll recall, is the one who said, faith without works is dead or barren, depending on the translation, right? That in effect, what God wants to see from you when he's deciding which place you're going to go is he essentially rolls back the video of your life and sees if you behaved in a way consonant with the Ten Commandments, right? And if you did, you're in, and if you didn't, you're out, right? Paul, on the other hand, had a more sophisticated picture because he realized, well, damn, if you just have the Ten Commandments, those were there before Jesus. If you're going to have a Christianity, have a role for Christ, for Christ's sake. Sorry. Right? And so if you can just follow the Ten Commandments and do it yourself, well, that's just Judaism. That's not Christianity. And so James's sort of faction stayed with the Jews and reintegrated. Paul, meanwhile, got into trouble, as these people do, and had to go abroad, and he was in the diaspora. But he was the one who spread the good word, right? And so his version of Christianity won out, and his version of Christianity has a place for Christ. In an 80-year period of life, average, right, for those of us lucky enough to make it, we are too of the flesh and thus too dependent upon the world and our whims, and we will fail to act in accordance with the Ten Commandments. But what God looks at is whether or not we try, nevertheless, to try to scale that wall, if you will. And if we keep at our efforts and give our efforts in good faith to scaling that wall, Jesus reaches over and pulls us over. And in that case, what we have to do is make what he calls a living sacrifice of ourselves, right? Not, feed ourselves to the tigers, but to say, I am unworthy by myself. I am in need of a redeemer, because that's what Christ means, redeemer, right? And I am a kind of being that needs redemption from someone. That offers us a place for Christ, okay? Okay, well, Paul, I'm getting to it, was in the diaspora, which means he was around in the Caucasus and Greece, where mostly, right, it wasn't Hebrew that was being used as the language of record, the lingua franca, if you will. It was Greek. And so if Jews study the Torah, they're reading Hebrew. And if Muslims are studying Islam, they read the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah, right? But the Bible, right, the original Bible, was written in Greek. So Christian scholars were able to read Greek so that they could read Paul, and guess who else they could read? Frickin' Plato. Which is why I say they got the idea of heaven and there being another realm, a non-physical realm, from Plato, from the realm of the forms. Okay, back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche says that kind of setup, denying this life in the aim of attainment in an afterlife, makes human beings sick. That we deny ourselves here, and that is why we have to bring the Dionysian back. We have to kind of get back into ourselves, into our bodies here, if you will. Okay? So it requires neglect, right? Both Plato, right, the 2,500-year mistake, and Christianity require neglect of this life, requiring, as it does an Apollonian. Apollonian is rigid, self-denying approach to life. and that in making ourselves safer and a more predictable world, we've given our kind of soul away, and and have become more like Northern Europeans than Southern Europeans. And again, we're becoming less human, more likely to become a robot, which means slave. Okay?
I have a question.
Of course, I'm sorry I didn't see you. How you been, brother?
So, like, how does this...
Dude, your paper knocked me out.
Oh, thank you, man.
That was really over the top. I appreciate it. I know it's not your major, but maybe minor? You're all right. This is enough, right? This is too much already. What's your question, brother?
So what is, like, the difference, or is there a difference between, like, the, like, neglecting your Apollonian, how do you say it?
Apollonian.
Apollonian.
It takes a few times.
Yeah. How do you, what's the difference between, like, this Nietzsche stuff and, like, the golden mean with Aristotle, like, balancing the
Ooh. I see, I see that in Aristotelian terms, we would say that we've gone to the extreme of self-discipline. And that self-discipline can be overly done, right? We think of it as, look, I mean, I'm exhibit A of lacking self-discipline, right? Except when I'm here, I tried my best. I put on my Apollonian hat for you guys. But out there, it's a mess. No. I'm only exaggerating slightly, but yes, Nietzsche would say in Aristotelian terms that we have gone away from the mean and drifted too close to the shore of the Apollonian and have lost all contact with the Dionysian shore.
So with Aristotle, that's more like on an individual basis, like he says it's a relative mean, but like in Nietzsche's terms, is it relative, or is he saying like society as a whole is like on Apollonian?
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions, certainly, right? I mean, if only Nietzsche could have met Dostoevsky, right? They would have been besties. But there are certainly exceptions to this move, right? And I think he points to Southern Europe as being more in touch with their Dionysian, just because of their lifestyle. And damn, they sleep right in the middle of the day, man. That's that's pretty self-generous, if you will, right? But I think that's a good way of encapsulating it. And his prescription is not to run to the other side, but to rather get back to Aristotle's sweet spot in the middle, where we're engaged with both parts of ourselves, and we have a good dance between them, a good dialectic between them within ourselves. And that can be reflected in the individual and in society as a whole. And of course, there's a feedback loop between those, right? If you become famous for, hey, come to Dionysus Island, right? Don't think island. It's got bad associations lately. But you know what I'm saying, right? I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Was that the base of your question, or was that leading somewhere? No, that's super. I really appreciate it. My friend.
Since with Nietzsche, we're allowed to talk about his psychology a little bit.
There we go. Okay, let's have it.
How did he fit into his own ethical theory?
So this was something, so if you go to any bookstore or library, the most authoritative English translations of Nietzsche are done by a guy who was at Princeton, who's no longer with us, named Walter Kaufmann. Walter Kaufmann's prize grad student is who I learned from at UW-Madison back in the 90s. And we had an extensive back and forth about this. Nietzsche concluded, most scholars conclude that Nietzsche did not believe that he himself attained Übermensch status, but he was merely the herald. And my professor disagreed, but it's a good question, and I think if we stood here for the next 2 weeks talking, we wouldn't come to the bottom of it. But I just want to give you the shape of the conversation. It's a good question. Did Nietzsche walk the walk that he was talking, is what you're asking, right? I mean, the guy was weird. He would write letters home along with his soiled undergarments because he wouldn't clean them himself. That's PTSD from childhood, I'm pretty sure, right? And along with his dirty underwear, he would include notes to his sister telling her how stupid she was. And he was a total out and out. He was the uber incel. How about that? He was the OG incel. He wanted to bone a woman named, what's her name? Lou Salome. But actually, she ended up boning Sigmund Freud, talk about a love triangle, right? I say bone, you know what I mean. It's kind of a gesture, you know what I mean? But so, and that was the love of his life, and he never consummated that. So, yeah, if we're going to psychologize the guy, he is a rich garden deep in compost, if you will. But again, yeah, it's fun to psychologize them. I try to stick to the ideas, but with guys like this, it's a little tempting, as you might say. Okay, so going back to this idea that the framework of good and evil is the wrong one. The framework of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, see how I'm saying words like framework and approach and not system? He's anti-systematist, so I can't use that, right? I couldn't rightly use it, okay? That his framework of the Apollonian and Dionysian better capture humans in their true nature, okay? And what he's going to end up saying is that instead of being guided by logic, human beings should be, if they're going to move back towards reincorporating the Dionysian into their lives, that they need to supplant the fundamentality of logic and replace that with something more fundamental, which is music, which at first sounds really bizarre, right? So let's try to get at that idea. He once remarked, I would only believe in a God who knew how to dance. So God's black. They got natural rhythm. Oh, that's terrible. David. All right, now. God could be Marvin Gaye. Anybody here down with Marvin? I love Marvin Gaye, man. Yeah. Mercy, Mercy Me. Check out that song. Smoke that one. So let's see. Let's get a more clear picture on this distinction between Apollo and Dionysus as used by Nietzsche. Okay? Apollo represents harmony, progress. Thank you, Martha. Harmony, progress, clarity, logic, and the principle of individuation. That I am here, this distinct thing, and you are there, this distinct thing, right? Rather than in the Dionysian emphasizing our oneness, okay? So Apollo, harmony, progress, clarity, logic, and the principle of individuation. Dionysus, by contrast, represents disorder, intoxication, emotion, ecstasy, and unity. Right? Unity as opposed to the principle of individuation or drug-soaked orgies, as you might say, right? Now he says, these two human impulses exist in dialectic with one another. And the dialectic is a relationship of opposing forces. They're not necessarily battling each other, right? They're more in a dance, almost like yin and yang in the complementary symbol. You know the symbol, you know, you've seen it. Little black dot, little white dot, two fishies. There you go. Swimming. Apollonian. Okay, so where does Nietzsche get these ideas from? He talks about Apollonian and Dionysian because he read about them as represented in Greek tragedy, what we call plays, right? And we say, oh, that was a tragedy. Charlie Kirk getting shot was a tragedy, and it freaking was. Horrible one. But when Greeks say tragedy, they're talking about all of life, right? So they just mean stage representations, right? Greek tragedy just means stage plays. But they were very different from the ones that we have in, say, the 18th, 19th, from Shakespeare, for example, right? Apollonian and Dionysian juxtapositions appear in the interplay of Greek tragedy. The tragic hero of the drama, the main protagonist, struggles in an Apollonian way to try to make order out of the unjust and chaotic Dionysian world. Okay, so that's going back to this irrational core, and we've got a rational candy coating around it that tries to cope. Okay? So here is the case for why Nietzsche gives us the case why music should supplant logic. Okay? With respect to Schopenhauerian will, right? Schopenhauerian will is this picture of the cosmos as uncaring, chaotic, a maelstrom of indifferent forces, right? And that maelstrom, like quality of the cosmos, is best captured by a pre-Socratic philosopher named Heraclitus. I got the juice today, folks, and it's the material kind of demands it. So I know we're going a little longer than we usually do. I hope you're sticking with me. Heraclitus, how's this one doing? Much better. Molto. Now Heraclitus is beloved by Nietzsche because he kind of was the original person to deal with this Schopenhauerian chaos of the cosmos. Heraclitus was in dialogue with another pre-Socratic philosopher named Thales. Now Thales was the first philosopher in the Western tradition. The East was doing stuff way before we were, and they'll be doing it way after. No, I'm just kidding. Anybody here know Chinese? If we keep going the way we're going, we're going to all be speaking Chinese in about 10 years. You know that, right? Anyway, saying, our guard is down. It's really scary. But then we get communism. Yeah, see how that works out. But the same way it's always worked out, right? Anyway, back to philosophy. Thales was the first philosopher, and here's why. Back in Athens, they were without the benefit that we have of the periodic table of the elements. So in ancient Athens, any informed person in the know, right, of course knew that everything around us was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Sure, fine. But as philosophers, they were trying to get to the deeper meaning of things. And so trying to make the same move as was done in the first place, okay, see everything around you, even wood, even metal, plastic, well, no, plastic, right? But even ourselves is some configuration of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. What the pre-Socratics wanted to know is, okay, if we can do that move again, we can say which of those 4 is basic. Okay? And so Thales was the first one to jump into the pool, literally, and said, okay, among those 4, the most basic is water. So he said, it's all water. And that's what makes him the first philosopher. Not that it's water, obviously. But once you say it's all, you're doing philosophy. Right? And so Heraclitus was next. And he said, no, Thales, you silly boy. It's not all water. It's all fire. Sure, fine, whatever. But from that idea, he did come up with something substantive. He came up with this saying, all is flux. All is flux. Much as we like to think things are going to be there forever. No, there are no constants. In fact, the only constant is change. Okay? And change happens at various rates. And so we experience some things as more permanent than others. But everything is passing out of existence. Now can you see if all is flux and will is this pure maelstrom, how those two kind of rhyme with each other, how they complement one of each other as ideas. Heraclitus is also the guy who said, you can't step in the same river twice. Why can't you step in the same river twice? Ian.
the one thing that, like, when you step in it originally, it's going to be different than when you step in it again.
Exactly, that the nature of river is itself change. And even though you step in it 2 seconds later, its nature is different from what it was. Thank you most kindly. My friend.
This strikes me as like a philosophical ruse of entropy.
Yes. You know, there are two philosophers, and they're married, who both deal with entropy. The current chair of the department, her name is Shannon Musset. She's amazing, mind-blowing philosopher. And she just put out a book about 3 or 4 years ago called Entropic Philosophy. I would chase that down. It's fascinating. Or at least have AI summarize it for you. Right? And then Mike, oh God, what is Mike's last name? Shaw. Michael Shaw is a scholar. He reads ancient Greek, and he's first time I ever met him was up at the U, and he gave this wonderful paper on, I can't remember the philosopher's name, but it was the earliest, not the earliest because he could trace it back to Heraclitus, but somebody who actually better articulated the idea of entropy. Very excellent observation, my friend. Very, very good. Very astute. So, right. When we look at how Heraclitus explained the universe, that gave Nietzsche a framework to deal with what Schopenhauer had handed him. Okay? So, when we talk about will to power, okay, now we know why we're saying the word will there. Because even though the universe is this maelstrom of uncaring force, expressed in ourselves, we are teleological. And so we can take that universal will, and through our own individual, right? And they're the same thing, seen from two different perspectives, right? It's will through and through. But when we channel it the way we can as humans, right? That's the capacity that we're putting into play. And so it's will to, right? And what Plato and Socrates were after was will to truth, or will to knowledge. And Nietzsche said that's fine, so long as will to truth or will to knowledge serves will to power. So we've got to talk about what power is now, okay? Just a few more minutes. But so we're taking this force, right, and we're channeling it towards something. Well, ultimately, we know we're channeling it towards. We're channeling it to reinvigorate the Dionysian spirit within humanity, okay? So power in this sense, let's be clear right away, is not brute force, okay? Power is claiming oneself. Power is the casting off of systematicity. By not being such slaves to systems and casting off our slavery to systems, casting off systematicity for a musical model. We switch from being anal retentive and doing accounting, we become less like accountants and more like two figures dancing. And that captures us more in our humanity. Music can better maintain our understanding given this Heraclitean metaphysic where all is flux. If we're stuck to the Apollonian, stuck to logic, think of it as bend like the willow, break like the oak. Right? If we're so rigid as human beings toward our environment, and our environment is this Schopenhauerian maelstrom, better that we can kind of flow with it rather than trying to stand strong against it, in which case we're screwed, right? I don't know if any of you are into jazz, but my favorite jazz musician, one of them is Charlie Parker. And the innovation he made was he was able to not be a slave to the notes and on the page, and he could improvise, and he could improvise so well that he improvised in a way that no one had ever improvised before on a musical instrument. So while Europe was looking and laughing at America going, where's your Mozart? It was this black dude, okay? And so that's being Dionysian. is not having to be a slave to the notes on the page, but rather being able to improvise like a musician. And that's why he says music should supplant logic. Excellent musicians need no sheet music. They can navigate all maps. Okay? So that's, are you feeling it? Are you feeling the fatigue? Let's rest there for the day, my friends. Thank you so much for the marathon session. I know that was relatively longer and quite a bit more chock-a-block than we're used to. But I hope it made some sense. We'll return to these themes on Monday. I want to, because he's more complicated, because he's nonlinear, I want to take the time to make sure that you all feel comfortable talking about Nietzsche's ideas. So if you need anything, email me. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's the bigger proposal assignment that's due tomorrow?
Oh, I don't know what the hell Canvas is doing, but that has nothing to do with us.
Oh, okay.
And I couldn't find, where are you seeing that? Is it on the calendar?
It's on the assignments page.
Yeah, is it a module?
It's, wait, what were we talking about, the bigger proposal?
Yeah.
It's
So it's
on
right
my
here.
assignments page.
On assignments, I don't use the, okay, I'll go to the assignments page. I couldn't find it. No, so just to reiterate, never go to anything but the modules page, which is why I've made it the home page. Because Canvas, they really feel entitled to our time, folks, and it really pisses me off. I just did 3 hours of training online the other day, how not to grab ass in class. I know not to grab ass in class. Jesus Christ, don't make me do a quiz, for Christ's sake. But anyway,
Okay, so
yeah, there's all these features that I just don't bother doing because we don't need them.
So we're good tomorrow, don't?
Dude, forget it. Yeah, forget it. But thanks, assignments page. I'll go there and destroy it
Thank you.
with relish. Thank you, my friend. Have a great day, you guys.
You as well.
Thank you, brother. Take care, bud.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was hot. What is this? What is it? All right. Born to kill with the flower in my hand. Take a ride in my leather back seat. Oh. Fuerte.